Hello everyone, and welcome to this workshop in Chiapas. We're very excited that all of you came to San Cristóbal de las Casas, and I do apologize that I'm not able to be here with you, but I'm very grateful that you will be listening to this video, and our colleagues in Cantaro Azul will be more than happy to provide any clarifications and to answer some of the questions. And I really look forward to seeing you on Friday as we wrap up the workshop. So I would like to give a presentation first describing the water sector in Mexico, what the landscape and some of the main challenges, especially talking about the official data that exists around water availability, water quality, and its interaction with population. Then I will give a brief description of a study that we carried out in 2014, in which we went to everywhere in Mexico to document water services, the quality of water services in rural communities. And that gave us a very good insight and contrast to the official data that has been described by that characterizes Mexico. And then after that, I will finalize by giving a very short history of how Cantaro Azul evolved in the development of solutions, both for household water treatment and also for pipe systems. And I think this will provide a very good context for the next presentations and for the workshop as a whole. So we'll start by describing that Mexico is a country with huge diversity. This diversity starts with a cultural diversity, but it actually encompasses also a very big diversity in terms of ecosystems that in a big part respond both to the landscape, to the soil, and also that respond directly to the precipitation and just in general the climate. And so in Mexico you can see that the north, it's a very arid region. And then as we move to the south, we get to the tropics and we go to areas that have a very high precipitation. And so this provides, it's a big contrast in terms of the water challenges that exist in the country. In the north, you will find that there's, scarcity. It's a big problem, and in terms of contamination, you will see more physical and chemical contamination, especially arsenic, fluoride, and other contaminants like that. Microbiological contamination is more limited in the north because communities and cities use or tend to use more underground sources or aquifers that have certain protection for pathogens. Whereas in the south, you have much more water availability, but there is less infrastructure to bring that water to where it's needed. And in general, because also of problems with infrastructure, both sanitation and disinfection, you will find that there's much more pathogen contamination. So here's also a map where you can see the aquifers that have been overexploited in Mexico, and this is providing a very big challenge both for cities and also for agricultural and industrial water needs. And as you can see, most of these issues happen in the center of Mexico and in the north. It's also important to describe that, and to visualize what are the main uses of water in the country. You can see that about 3/4 of the water in Mexico is used for agricultural purposes. Only about 15% of the water is used for public uses, like in cities and communities. Then there's about 5% of use by the industry that have their own concessions for extracting and using water. And there's also about 5% that is used for power generation, mainly hydroelectric power. Then this gives you an idea of water availability in Mexico and its main uses. But it's particularly for the type of work that we do and that we're interested here in the workshop and in this conversation. It's very important to see that Mexico, the population in Mexico is quite dispersed. Although most inhabitants now in Mexico live in the cities, there are about 25 million people that live in rural communities. In Mexico, we define rural communities as any place that has less than 2,500 people living in it. And then in rural communities, there's still a lot of heterogeneity. Like more than 50,000 communities have between 100 and 2,500 people. But there are 140,000 communities with less than 100 people living in them. So this presents two types of challenges. The rural communities with larger population, have small amount of economical resources, but they do have, and there are many of them, 50,000, but they do have certain density, But then there's this 140,000 communities, which is a huge number, is a very big number, that are dispersed all across the country, especially in the center and the south, and there's just a small number of families living in each of them, and so this presents a very different challenge than in the larger rural communities. So here are just a couple of maps using the official data about access to what it's called potable water. In reality, this is just describing access to pipe water. But you can see that states like Guerrero, Michoacán, Oaxaca, Chiapas, and Veracruz are the ones that have more municipalities with like almost 0 or less than 50% access to pipe water. And in contrast, the communities in the center and north of Mexico, they have much more access. There are some exceptions, especially you see here towards the west, there's the mountain range where there's very little access happening as well. In this other slide, you have the percentage of chlorinated water. So the health ministry in Mexico samples water quality and especially just to see if there is chlorine in the pipe distribution systems. They do this. They give notification to the systems that they're going to come and do a test, and so these numbers tend to give an idea of much more chlorination that what's actually happening. But even in this case, you see that all across Mexico, municipalities have a big challenge in terms of delivering disinfected water. In this graph, you can see how urban population has increased, from the 90s to 2010, and it went from almost 60 million to almost 90 million. And you can see that coverage of pipe water in urban areas, there was a gap starting with about 6 million people, and that gap still exists. So, investments in pipe water in urban communities, in urban contexts, they have followed growth of urban growth, but they have not closed the existing gap in terms of actual numbers. And then in the rural population, you see that rural population has become almost stable, going from about 23 million to about 26 million, and access to pipe water in the 90s was about 50% in rural communities, and now it's closer to 80%. So you see that Mexico has been able to close the gap in terms of access to pipe water, but not fully close it. There's still around another 6 million people that don't have access to pipe water in rural communities. And there's a very similar story in terms of sewage, and this does not take into consideration if the sewage is actually treated, but just in terms of sewage infrastructure, you do see a gap that was closed in urban areas over the past years, and then an even bigger gap that was closed in the rural communities. Rural communities started in the 90s with almost no sewage, and so more than 10 million people in the past 20-30 years gain access to sewage. However, it's important to note here that although can be perceived as something positive, it also creates many problems, because most sewage goes directly into a river or goes through a treatment plant that has been installed but is not working. So one can say that the risk of drinking contaminated water has increased as sewage has been implemented and has been spilling into the water sources of communities that are further downstream in the watershed. So yeah, and this is something that happens in Mexico. You'll see that there's more infrastructure, but the infrastructure is actually not working very well, and that sometimes creates more challenges, but particularly in the case of sewage and sanitation. So in this graph, I mean, it's kind of a complex graph, but what you can see is how what the officials in Mexico try to describe with this graph is how mortality of gastrointestinal diseases have plunged between the 90s up to the 2013. And there's a curve, especially in the 90s, like between 1990 and 2000, mortality due to gastrointestinal illness really went down. And then since then, it has steadily kept going down. And what this graph tries to explain is that the increase in pipe water and sewage coverage has been responsible to this. But this story, we don't really think it's complete. I mean, first, you see that the increases have been much more steadily in terms of pipe water and sewage, and there's a very big drop-off in terms of mortality. And so we actually believe that drop-off in mortality has to do more with information. So more people, particularly in rural communities, know now that gastrointestinal illness, especially when they become very acute, lead to dehydration. And they have also now more access to oral rehydration therapy. And so we actually believe that it's the extension of health services and health information that have caused this decrease in mortality. And although we do not have a graph like this, morbidity, so the incidence of getting diarrhea and gastrointestinal illnesses, have not followed this steep decline as mortality has followed it. So in many of the rural communities where we work, gastrointestinal illness remains the second cause of morbidity after respiratory illness, and that has not changed. I mean, that definitely changes in urban settings, and also that has happened. I mean, gastrointestinal illness is far, from being one of the first morbidity causes in industrialized countries, and so we believe that the root causes have not been addressed. Like water quality still remains a big issue. People get exposed to pathogens, and that causes a lot of morbidity. It's good that mortality is not as acute as before, or not as present as before, but millions of children are growing up with chronic gastrointestinal illness, and that's one of the main contributors to malnutrition and a limited cognitive and physical growth of children. That in a country like Mexico, where children that grow up in rural communities already have very limited services and face like a very steep slope in terms of equality with their counterparts in urban areas, just having growing up with malnutrition and impacting their ability to grow to their full potential becomes another big factor that continues to create poverty and produce poverty in Mexico. So we believe that it's critical to develop new mechanisms to reduce the exposure to pathogens and have a real impact on malnutrition, and at least at that level reduce some of these big steep slopes that children face as they grow and as they become part of a society that is very diverse and very unequal in a country like Mexico. So now that was just very, very broad characterizations of the problems of Mexico. What it's important to take away from that is that it's a big country, more than 120 million people. Water challenges happen more in rural communities, but they actually happen across the country, and not only in states like Chiapas. And although it is very important to develop solutions for regions like Chiapas, these solutions can actually develop lessons that are useful for the rest of the country. So now I would like to describe a study that Cantaro Azul carried out. It was really the first study that looked at water quality of a program of a key program of the Water National Commission that has been implemented for over 30 years in rural communities. So it's a program that it's meant to implement water and sanitation infrastructure. And the program actually encompasses in its rules the possibility to strengthen local capacity and to foster the development of services, of sustainable services. But in reality, this program has focused only in the investment of infrastructure. And we had seen in many communities where we had worked that this infrastructure was not delivering the benefits that it could deliver. But when we carried out this study, I mean, we got a picture of the program implemented across the country and the challenges that it faced. So this is a study that we carried out in 2014. It was commissioned by the Inter-American Development Bank. And again, the study focused on a program by the Water National Commission that targets rural communities with water and sanitation interventions. So the objective of the study was to understand the factors that affect the quality of the service that is being provided, and also if how the population perceive this service. So we used socioeconomical indicators. We also looked at how the systems are managed from an engineering perspective, and we looked at the quality of the water at different points in the community. And we carried out interviews to local authorities, particularly those in community-based water management organizations. And we also interviewed directly people at their home. So this map, which has 300 red dots, just gives you an idea of the distribution of the systems that we ended up, of the distribution of the communities where we carried out the evaluation. And so you can see that it was all over the country. There were more interviews happening in the South because the program has been implemented more in the South. So we selected these communities randomly, but we also stratified it accordingly to the proportion of communities that have been beneficiaries of the program across different regions in the country. And so here you can see a map. Like we developed maps of communities based on distance from where the water comes into the pipe system. And so what we were trying to do here is selecting 9 households where we would do an interview, but we wanted these 9 households to be also stratified according to the distance of the system, so that we could get a picture. We were hypothesizing that houses that are closer to the system might have or received or perceived a different quality of service than those that are far from where the system begins or is connected. So again, like we carried out, in each of the communities, we carried out one interview to a person that participates in the water committee, and we carried out interviews in 9 different households. So we did water quality tests, and so we had a more comprehensive test at the system level. We tried to take the samples in the places where the water is coming out from a tank, and after it has gone through disinfection, if there was any disinfection of treatment. Most of the systems that we sampled had tanks, but if there was no tank, then we selected a point right before entering the community. And then we carried out water quality tests in only 3 of the 9 households that were visited, and 1 in each of the stratum that I described before. And here we collected the samples from the tap coming directly from the pipe system, not after it had been stored. So we divide the types of sampling into big groups. First, physicochemical testing, and so we had some immediate tests that we could do, like pH, temperature, salinity, total dissolved solids, conductivity, total chlorine, free chlorine, color, and turbidity. Then we also had analysis that we could do between 6 and 8 hours after sampling, and that was nitrates, hardness, and arsenic. And then we had other analyses that we could preserve the samples and carry it out within 28 days of the sampling, and that was fluoride, sulfates, iron, and manganese. And then there were the bacteriological tests, where we had to carry out the analysis within 6 to 8 hours of sampling, and we used E. coli and we used most probable number in this particular case, because we had different teams across the country and we didn't have much equipment. We used the CBT method of aquagenics, where the samples can be incubated at environmental temperature. We don't have to use a particular incubator, and this method only tests for E. coli, which we think it's a much better proxy for fecal contamination, and there's plenty of literature that supports this, and so we didn't use total coliforms. And again, here also you can see that the certain physicochemical tests, we only carry them out in the system because we don't expect any change happening between the system and like the entry point of the system and the households. But there were some that we, like chlorine, for example, and a few others that we carried out both at the system and at the household level, and also the bacteriological ones. So here are just some pictures of the type of, in the upper row you can see some of the tanks or some of the wells with pipe systems, and where we collected the samples. And then in the bottom row you can see some of the taps, different contexts of taps in different types of places where the samples were also collected at the homes. So just to give you an idea of the logistics, we had 5 teams with a leader of the team, and then a technician focused on the interviews and a technician focused on the logistics. And these 5 teams spread all across the country, and from a period between August to November in 2014. And of course there were also coordinators that focus on different aspects of the study, and also supervisors that went and followed the teams to check that everything was being followed. We also used blanks to control, and the type of tests that we did were very, with the controls that we used, we can say that they were very reliable. So the preliminary results that we got, just to give you some idea, in terms of the source of water that is used by the systems, 1/4 of it is surface water, like rivers and streams, and 3/4, 3/4, like 75% was underground water. And about half of the systems had some type of pumping, and then around 40% were just gravity-fed systems. And then 70% of the systems provided water for only one community, and 30% provided water to multiple communities. Just gives you an idea of what type of water sources we have, how the water is being distributed, and also to where, if it's only one community or a group of them. Then in this other graph, you can see that, again, like 3/4 of the communities are managed by community-based water management systems or organizations. And then about 16% by municipalities, 5% by the state, and then 5% by some other method. And then out of the ones that are managed by the municipalities and states, which is about 20%, still more than half of them actually form local communities to provide some support. And so what this gives you an idea is that community-based water management is critical in Mexico to ensure that these systems are being operated. And so this gives you also, another thing that we can draw from here is that the states and the municipalities do not have the capacity to provide directly water service in rural communities. And this, in big part, has to do with the dispersion of these communities, and also with the fact that the institutions in Mexico have in general been reduced. The amount of staff in institutions in Mexico have in general been reduced, and the state, the government has lost the capacity to provide services directly outside of urban areas. Here in this graph you can see that these organizations usually have like 3 people, and that's the president, the secretary, and the treasurer. And you can see in the columns that most of them are men, so around 80% are men and 20% are women. Particularly, this difference, this gap in terms of gender equity happens even more at the highest decision level, which is the president. The other thing that we can learn from here is that these committees are actually structured as something that is meant to supervise, not something that is meant to operate and provide a service. And that has to do because these committees are created many times when the infrastructure is being implemented. So at the moment where the project arrives to the community, it's a big project, it's an important project that has to organize the community to participate on it. And so it's important to form a committee that supervises the use of the resources, the participation of the people. And so a structure like president, secretary, treasurer makes sense for that. However, the problem is that as there's a transition from the implementation of the infrastructure to the operation of the system, this structure is still being used, and there's no significant change to create a structure to actually provide an operation. Many times what these committees do is that they recruit another person that is called a bombero. It's really the person that operates the pump, la bomba, so that's why it's called bombero, not because it's a firefighter. And so this bombero just follows some of the guidelines, but it doesn't receive any like technical training or social training to be able to operate the system in a more effective way. And the other aspect that it's important to highlight here is that 90% of the people that participate in these organizations, in these community-based organizations, do not receive any income. So they are doing this in a voluntary basis. And so this also gives you, it's also important to know that if you want to provide a service, you have to invest a lot of time in it. But if you are not receiving any payment, it's very difficult to do that. So this creates a tension of that you will see in the results that I'm going to present later, that really limits the possibility of having actually a sustainable service. So this graph just gives you an idea that 20% of the systems that were implemented have been abandoned, and about 80% are still functioning. This is, I mean, of course we would like to see the abandonment of systems decrease, but these systems were implemented most of them between 2000 and 2010. So we can expect that some systems have been abandoned, but it's not. We don't see it as one of the major limitations of the program. In this graph, these graphs talk about payments of services, and so 60% of communities are actually paying a water fee. This water fee is usually 3/4 of them are paying on a monthly basis, but then the other fourth is paid either every 2 months or an annual basis. And many times these monthly or bi-monthly payments are complemented by additional payments when there is a major break in the system or in the infrastructure that is used to operate the system. And in the graph that it's below in the left bottom corner, you can see that the biggest expenses have to do with electricity for pumping water. And this has been a major driver for limiting the operation of the systems. And so many times, the companies that are implementing the program under the government guidelines, they are in a strong time pressure to implement the systems. And so they might see that there's spring that is nearby and that it's upstream, and that you could use gravity you could use gravity to feed the system, but it might be more complex to make that happen, because you might have to go through land that is part of different members of the community or of the ejido, which is this communal land. And so sometimes they decide to bring water from a well or from downstream, where it might be closer and easier to install. And these type of decisions have big implications for the ongoing operation of the systems. And so it's very common to see, a community that had hoses that were bringing water from a spring, and then suddenly this program comes to improve infrastructure, and they develop like formal pipe systems, but they start extracting water from a lower height, and so that has to be pumped. And then when the community fronts the payment of the electricity, then sometimes they just stop using that new system. And so this presents a very big challenge between planning with the community, being able to adapt to the community settings, have more work with the social elements and socioeconomic elements, versus just coming and implementing something that is standardized and very quickly. And this definitely has a very big impact in operation and maintenance. And then you can see also that 80% of the fees that are paid for the water are paid based on a fixed amount, not an amount based on consumption. Although one could also argue that in these rural communities, they're not really creating a big stress on the water, but what ends up happening is that if there are some big consumers that do not see the benefit of consuming less because they're paying a fixed amount, then the households that are farther away, usually the ones that have less resources, then they end up facing the challenges of less pressure on the pipe water. So now we move into the treatment of water. And so in the top left graph, you can see that almost half of the systems have some sort of technology for treating the water. And out of this half, 80% claim that they're using it. So this gives you about 38% of the communities where a system is operating do actually have treatment and are using it in a daily basis. In the graph that it's on the right side, you can see that most of the treatment is chlorination, whether it's sodium hypochlorite or calcium hypochlorite, mostly sodium hypochlorite. There's very little osmosis that is happening, and almost even a smaller amount of UV disinfection. And then there's also this almost 30% that do not claim that they do not know what type of treatment is happening in the community. And so now we see the results, and these are the results of samples collected at the system. So only 11% of the samples that we collected have free chlorine that meets the Mexican norms. And these, the majority do not have any chlorine, and there is a small amount of samples that we collected that had more chlorine than the maximum allowed by the Mexican standards. And so this tells you, this just gives you an idea of how bad and how bad the problem might be, if there is very little disinfection happening. Especially when I mentioned that upstream there are many communities that are just pouring their sewage directly into the streams, or that are nearby communities, or the same community pouring its sewage into the aquifer that is being used as a source for the community. This also doesn't capture the fact that chlorine, in order for it to be effective, it needs a combination of concentration and time. And in these rural communities, you will see that in many occasions the chlorination happens very close or very nearby to the first households, and there are usually we really didn't see any tanks that are used to increase the time, or contact time tanks. So even in these 11% where the norm is being met, that doesn't mean that there's actually effective disinfection happening. Also, as you might know, chlorine might be effective for bacteria and viruses, but is not very effective for Giardia and Cryptosporidium. And most of the systems that we visited didn't have any type of treatment, additional treatment, or protection of the source that would reduce the risk of presence of Giardia or Cryptosporidium in the water source. So when you look to the right and you see the graph of E. coli, 41% of the samples had a presence of E. coli. And in general, like 1/4 of the samples had a very high concentration of E. coli. And so E. coli is a proxy for fecal contamination. And so right away, and this was just one time picture in the community. So one could easily say that more than half of the communities in rural Mexico where the program has been implemented, which is communities that have received more support from the government, are distributing water with fecal contamination. And so people are at a very high risk of getting gastrointestinal illness. And this, again, does not even count the communities that have not participated in a program like this, that easily might face a more stark or of a bigger problem. One thing that is interesting, though, is that as we move to see how we change from these results to the results collected at the households, and you basically do not see any significant change. The disinfection is almost the same, and the presence of chlorine is almost the same, and the presence of E. coli is almost the same. And this is important because, when we looked at cities, if you have a system that is distributing water sporadically, like intermittently, as most cities in Mexico do, and in most rural communities in Mexico do, when the pipes have pressure, there are fractures in the pipes, so there's the water gets out of the pipes. But then when they don't have pressure, water comes into the pipes again. And in the cities, we have known for a long time that produces a lot of contamination in the pipe systems, because you have sewage nearby, because the pipe water systems that distribute water gets into the homes, they're old and they're usually made of structures that are easy to crack. And so, in a city, an intermittent supply is almost, a signal for bad water quality. But what we found here in rural communities is that we don't see much contamination happening in the systems. And so this gives us an opportunity that if we control quality at the entry of the water into the community, then it's very likely that we will, even in an intermittent system, we will have the same quality coming out at the taps. And so we think that there's a case here for really having an intervention that improves quality, and that even with an intermittent system, people will have access to much better water quality than they're having now. Then we move into the physicochemical parameters, and so we, here you have like temperature, salinity, conductivity, pH, total dissolved solids, and you see, you see that turbidity, about 7% of the samples that we collected were above the Mexican norm, and total dissolved solids and color were about 15% outside of the Mexican norms. And the results, again, are very similar between the samples collected at the system and the samples collected at the taps. But these parameters per se, they do not create or pose a health hazard. They just give you an idea of the quality of water that is coming in. However, this other graph, we can see here the results for hardness, nitrite, arsenic, fluoride, sulfide, manganese, and iron. And for most of these parameters, there's a significant amount of contamination in the water that people are consuming. And I would particularly like to highlight nitrate and nitrites, where around 20% of the samples that we collected are contaminated. The range is nitrite 14 and nitrite 27%. Arsenic, almost 20% of the samples were contaminated, and fluoride about 30%. Iron, again, almost 40%, and manganese 70%. So you see this gives you a picture of a very high risk of contamination of physicochemical components in the water in these communities. What we learned through this period is that the Mexican government has been focusing on the implementation of infrastructure. If you see the expenditures of this program, 98% of the expenditures were to hire companies, most of them local companies, to implement, local companies meaning like state level companies, to implement these pipe water systems and sanitation systems. And only 2% was used of that funding was used to strengthen local capacity and capabilities, and also to foster the development of sustainable services. The program allowed for those investments to be much higher than that. They actually do not place a maximum amount, but just the way the public policy is implemented, it really favors the implementation of infrastructure, and that's probably a goal set by the federal government and in a way by the ministry that looks at finances, and there's a very big bias for investing in infrastructure. But also has to do with, like, you know, these companies at the state level, they're trying to receive funding from the government to implement programs, and there are very few companies that have capacity for, you know, for strengthening local capabilities and capacity, or that are interested in doing that. So we think that with the existing norms and existing public programs, there's a space for changing that dramatically. But we need also to develop successful cases of how that can be done. And this has been the objective of Cantaro Azul throughout the past years, to really, through pilots, and to really show that by investing more in developing local capabilities, and by also investing in taking existing infrastructure and making it useful and making it deliver safe water, we can change and transform the sector in Mexico. And of course, the next step is doing that in collaboration with the government, and ensuring that the government takes these lessons and then scales them through, you know, at the national level. And so, you know, that the big lesson that we learned through our work and through this study is that there has to be a very important paradigm shift from focusing on the implementation of infrastructure to the development and fostering of sustainable services. So now we would like to just give you a very brief description of how Cantaro Azul has evolved in its work. And so Cantaro Azul, we started working in the north, in the Baja California Peninsula, in very small communities that used springs, like very small springs, or that use well water. And in these communities, people for many years, they have been listening they have been participating in meetings organized by the health ministry, where the health ministry said, like, look, there are these pathogens in the water, they're causing diarrhea, they're causing malnutrition, and so it's important to drink clean water. But there is no infrastructure to provide clean water. So what you should do as a user, or as a person living in these communities, is either use chlorine to disinfect the water or boil the water. But really, chlorine in Mexico means bleach, you know, the product that is used for washing toilets and also scrubbing like floors. And so it's a very highly concentrated solution, and the concentration of the solution is very unstable, so it's very difficult to dose accordingly. And so people, you know, when they try to chlorinate with bleach, it just doesn't happen. You know, they contrast the water that is coming from what they perceive are safe sources and are more natural sources, and so adding bleach into the home is just, I mean, they might do it a few times, but they end up giving up. Most of families end up giving up in using bleach. And boiling, it's also so hard to carry out and so intensive. Like, you have to collect the wood, or you have to pay for the gas, and then you have to heat the water, let it boil, and then let it cool down. Also, when it cools down and then it's extracted, it gets contaminated again because it's not stored in a safe container. And so just, you know, it's too much hassle for people to do this in an ongoing basis. And we did very objective studies, and we found that less than 5% of the families were either using chlorine or boiling in a consistent basis. More than 80% respond that they do it, but you know, when you look at when was the last, The last time that you drank water, if it had been chlorinated or boiled, less than 5% are actually doing that. So that led us to, in collaboration with the University of California in Berkeley, that led us to design a UV disinfection system that produced water, 20 liters of water in 5 minutes, didn't change the taste of the water, and it was really easy to operate. And it was also very effective, like it targeted bacteria, viruses, and protozoa. And it also had a safety margin where, like, even at the end of the lifetime of the lamp, it was producing twice the minimum required to inactivate this broad spectrum of pathogens, the minimum dose. And so we had like a very effective method for disinfecting the water that was very easy to use by people. And so we carried out a pilot with 24 systems, and people were just, everyone started using it, and everyone was using it in a daily basis. And so this gave us the insight that by reducing these big barriers that chlorine and boiling had, we could really make a dent in terms of in terms of use of household water treatment. And then we, after through a process of working several years with very direct contact with the communities, we came up with the Mesita Azul, which was an improvement of the first prototype, and particularly an improvement that realized that households don't usually have infrastructure where you can set up a system, and so the Mesita Azul created its own space and its own structure to be able to disinfect the water. But also we noticed that people were very sensitive to aesthetics as well, and very sensitive to something that was practical. So we recognized that it was important not to design a system that was the cheapest possible, but to design a system that understood what were the dimensions in which people value water or items related to water, like aesthetics, for example, or something that makes them be proud to have in their home, and then design a product that met those values that that were expressing. So we came up with the Mesita Azul. We complemented the Mesita Azul with a social program that had interactions with the community to value the importance of clean water, and also to train local technicians that could provide maintenance to the systems. So we ended up implementing a program in the Baja California Peninsula with more than 400 families using the systems. And we were very thrilled, we were very excited, and we were having very good results. And then we carried out a very rigorous randomized control trial to understand the health impact of this intervention, to follow water quality from the source to as it goes through the system, as it's stored in the container, and as people drink it in their glass. And then we also looked at how people in the home interacted with the technology for treating water, but also how people in the home interacted with drinking the water had been treated, or the water that was not treated but was available for other purposes. And we have a couple of papers that describe this, but really what I want to highlight is that as we roll out this program, about 80% of the families decided to make a payment and acquire the system. The system was subsidized, but the families paid about $10 if they wanted to get the system, so they were expressing some interest. Most of the systems continue to operate after a year. 60% of the families that were targeted in the community, not of the ones that have the system, but that were targeted in the community, 60% of the families had water disinfected by the Mesita Azul at the time that we visited them, which was not announced. So this was pretty good. We went from like 5% having access to safe water to almost 60%. However, the main challenge that we saw was that half of that 60%, people in the home were also drinking untreated water. So they had gone through the hassle of acquiring a system, operating the system almost on a daily basis, having water, disinfected water available, recognizing that disinfected water is important, but still drinking untreated water that was available at the home. And this was like a bucket of really, really cold water, just for us as Cantaro Azul. because we thought that we had addressed the main challenges for adopting a household water treatment system, but we were not getting the results that we wanted. I mean, we knew that if we want to have public health impact, most of the people in the community need to drink safe water really most of the time. And here, most of the people had access to treating water, and most of the people had access to treated water, but only 30% were drinking disinfected water in a consistent and exclusive basis. And so this created, we understood that there two things needed to change. One was that we were focusing, again, mostly on the infrastructure and focusing mostly on the members of the household that actually operate the infrastructure. And we were also empowering people to gain access to safe water, but we were also transferring them a series of responsibilities that if you live in a city, if you live in the US or if you live in Europe, as a user, you don't have those responsibilities. You open the tap and the water is clean to drink. You buy a bottle of water and the water is clean to drink. Whereas here, the household had to absorb the responsibility of operating the system, making sure that they're operating correctly, making sure that if it breaks, getting a technician, and then making sure that if the children are drinking water from somewhere else, they have to tell them, no, you don't have to drink them there, you have to drink from here. And so these additional responsibilities have different impact depending on which type of household you are. And so if you're a household that is interested in drinking safe water and you have more resources to control your everyday life, then this empowerment of household water treatment, like the Mesita Azul, it's enough to transform your reality. And then suddenly you have water that is as clean as if you were in the city buying bottled water, or is as clean as if you were in an industrialized country with tap water. But if you are a household that faces many challenges every day, this empowerment maybe at the beginning makes you change your habits or your practices. But then there are so many risks that come with every day, and so many challenges, that these additional responsibilities end up it's very difficult for these families to absorb these additional responsibilities. And then so the outcome of the program for them just goes down, and also the potential to improve their health also starts to disappear. And so what we realize is that these programs that focus mostly on the infrastructure and that are implemented in unequal societies or societies with a lot of inequality, they develop or they generate benefits for particular groups of people, but they fail at developing benefits for the public. And it is actually something very similar to the story that we described earlier on with the pipe systems. The pipe systems, they come with infrastructure that allow for the distribution of clean water. But it really depends on which type of community you are. If you're a community that has a lot of support from institutions, you're a community that has more resources that can afford a professional, to operate the system, this initial empowerment that the infrastructure gives you is enough to provide a service that benefits almost everyone in the community, and that it's a public health benefit. But if you're a community that faces many challenges, that doesn't have this institutional support, this empowerment comes with many responsibilities and also is likely to lead to a failure or to lower benefits that could be provided initially. So this just reinforces the importance of changing a paradigm of seeing infrastructure or technologies or products as a solution, and then having to reconfigure that and say what we really need is sustainable services. And this is particularly if you want to have a health impact. If you're not interested in that, and if you're interested in just having people access, then you can focus on infrastructure, and infrastructure provides access. The issue is that people do not deliver the benefits of that access. And so that was one of the things that we learned. We really have to focus on sustainable services, that those sustainable services can target the households or the communities that face more challenges, and that those services can distribute the responsibilities in a more even way so that they do not become a burden to derive the benefits of the initial empowerment provided by the infrastructure. The other approach is that in a home that has many points of access to water that are not treated, and only one or two that have points of access that have treated water or disinfected water, then there will always be the risk that people will be exposed to drinking to contaminated water. Think of the home where you live, or for myself, the home where I live. I mean, water that is contaminated, it's in the toilet, but the rest of the water sources or points of access in the home are clean. So I don't have to tell my children what's the water they need to drink. They just, wherever they drink, because maybe when they're toddlers, they might drink from the toilet, but after that age, wherever they drink, the water is clean. Whereas in these communities, in these households, most of the points of access of water are not clean. So if you're thirsty and you drink from it, then you're exposed to the contamination. So there's also something that can be done with technology and infrastructure, and that is, if all the water that is accessible in the home is treated, then it's much easier, to foster these public health changes, because there's going to be less risks happening in homes, especially homes where face a lot of challenges. Now, that doesn't mean that the water that is kept outside of the home, that is used for watering the plants and giving that water to the animals, also needs to be treated. That people don't drink from it. But I'm referring more to the water that is used for washing the dishes, for bathing, and that is more in contact with people. So these two pathways to increase we identified that there are these two pathways that can really transform the water sector in rural communities. One is to foster sustainable services, and the other one is to ensure that all the points of access in the water where people interact with themselves and that use for cleaning, like cooking utensils and eating utensils, they can really make a big difference. And so these two pathways have become, or these two strategies have become what we are interested in doing in collaboration with all of you. And so you will see in the other presentations, and as you go to the field, that we're trying to change that. We're still using the Mesita Azul and other household water systems, but we're trying to structure them as part of services and not only the implementation of these products or the distribution of these products. You will also see that we have done a pilot in which water is disinfected with chlorine. The chlorine is brought up to a higher level to ensure that the water is disinfected. By the time that it arrives to all of the households, it's disinfected. But we also reduce the chlorine with activated carbon in one point in the home where people extract the water and put it in a container and use it for drinking purposes. So all the points of access in the home deliver water with chlorine that is safe to drink. It might have too much chlorine. People might not want to drink from it. But when they want to drink water, they go to this one point that is also safe to drink and doesn't have chlorine. And so these have been two aspects that we would like you to look at during the visits, and that we would like you to talk about with other team members of Cantaro Azul. And also just to say that we're not stopping there. In Cantaro Azul, we're also collaborating with State Congress in Chiapas to ensure that there is a law that there's a new water law that recognizes community-based water organizations, and that creates a mechanism to strengthen the capacity and capability of these organizations. And also that ensures that the solutions that are being implemented take into consideration what is needed in the communities in order to be more effective. We're also very interested in these community-based organizations to form their own organization that supports them. And we believe we have seen the experience in Central and South America, where these community-based organizations, they form associations and confederations that in these associations they are able to learn from each other, develop best practices, replicate those best practices, but most importantly, they're able to join their voices into a stronger voice that then can have more symmetric interactions with organizations like Cantaro Azul and the government, in order to identify and construct public policies that are more effective. And so with these strategies and with a collaboration with, as part of this project, we believe that we can really transform the water sector for rural Chiapas, and that we can develop lessons that can have also an impact across Mexico and across other countries in Latin America. So again, welcome to the workshop. We're really, really excited. We're thrilled that you all came here, and we're really looking forward to increase our collaboration and be colleagues in changing and transforming the lives of thousands of people. Thank you very much.